So I think we'll get started. I'm Miranda Brown, and I will be introducing our speaker today. So you are at the CCS Noon Lecture Series, and I have a few announcements before I introduce the speaker. First, next Tuesday, February 18th, the CCS Noon Lecture Series will present Scott Kennedy, Associate Professor in the Department of Political Science and East Asian Languages and Cultures at Indiana University, who will be speaking on From Rule Takers to Rule Makers, Chinese and Global Governance. On Tuesday evening, February 18th, the CCS Chinese Film Series will present Piercing 1, the first independently produced feature-length animated film to come out of China. The director, Liu Jian, will be on hand to talk to the audience and to answer questions. The film will be shown at 7 p.m. in the Stern Auditorium of the University of Michigan Museum of Art and is recommended for mature audiences only. It is free and open to the public. Third, from February 7th to 21st, 2014, the Chinese Classical Dance Residency featuring dancers Xiao Wei, not sure about the pronunciation here, but I guess Wei Qiu and Zhang Jun, and hosted by UM Assistant Professor Emily Wilcox, right in front of you, will present a series of presentations that will include talks, a master class, a film screening, and performances. A schedule of all activities planned within this series is available here today. All are free and open to the public. We will be appreciated if you would take a moment to turn off your cell phones before the talk begins. So today's presentation will be given by Micah Muscolino, Associate Professor of History at Georgetown University. His area of expertise is the environmental history of late imperial and modern China. Before coming to Georgetown, he taught for 2 years at St. Mary's College of California. He spent 2010-2011 as a member of the School of Historical Studies at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, New Jersey, with support from a Mellon Fellowship for Assistant Professors and the National Endowment for the Humanities. His first book, Fishing Wars and Environmental Change in Late Imperial and Modern China, was published in 2009. He has recently completed a second book, manuscript entitled The Ecology of War in North China's Henan Province, 1938 to 1950, that investigates the environmental history of World War II and the Chinese Civil War of 1946 to 1949 by focusing on the socio-ecological consequences of the Nationalist military's strategic diversion of the Yellow River in 1938 and its aftermath. Today, he will be speaking on Earth, Water, and Power, the Ecology of War in North China's Henan Province. Please join me in welcoming him.
Well, thank you, Miranda, for the introduction, and thanks to Ina for arranging my visit, and thanks to everybody for taking time out of your busy schedules to come and listen to this talk. So today, I am talking about this book, which I've recently completed, which with all luck will come out in October. And this is actually the original title of the book, which was nixed by the publisher. But anyway, the Ecology of War part stayed in it. So as the introduction indicated, this is a book that looks at the environmental impacts of war in one particular region of China. And that's what I'm going to be talking about today. So during the anti-Japanese War of Resistance of 1937 to 1945, as World War II is usually referred to in China, Henan Province, the region that I would be looking at, endured a series of war-induced disasters. The first struck in 1938 when nationalist armies breached the Yellow River's dikes in a desperate attempt to block a Japanese military advance. For the next 9 years, the Yellow River flowed southeast into the Huai River via its tributaries. This strategic interdiction threw water control systems into complete disarray, leading to floods that persisted until after the war's end. Post-war estimates found that the floods killed over 800,000 people and made nearly 4 million into refugees in the provinces of not just Henan, but also Anhui and Jiangsu. In Henan alone, which is the province that I've been focusing on, the wartime deluges killed over 325,000 people and displaced 1.17 million. And here we have some images that I got from the Henan Provincial Archives of this massive displaced population. So you can see the toll that this took on the area's population. Some more. But things got worse in 1942 and 1943 when an El Nino event, wartime disruption of transport, and the food energy demands of Chinese and Japanese armies that were stationed in Henan combined to precipitate a famine of terrific magnitude. The Henan famine led to as many deaths, approximately 2 million, as the Bengal famine that happened at the same time. Millions more of Henan's residents took to the roads in order to flee the subsistence crisis. Now, historians of 20th century China in recent years have highlighted the formative significance of war and militarization in modern Chinese politics, economy, and culture. But research on the environmental history of war in Chinese history, particularly the Sino-Japanese War of 1937 to 1945, as well as its aftermath, is long overdue. By exploring Henan's wartime ecological upheavals, the book on which this talk is based captures war's importance as a distinctive force shaping human interactions with the natural world, as well as the environment's role in shaping warfare. Environments mold the experience of warfare for soldiers and civilians alike, while war and militarization also transform human relationships with the natural world in enduring ways. As a hotly contested area in the Sino-Japanese War, Henan suffered as much human disruption and environmental damage as any other part of China. One of my main points that I make in the book and also in this talk is that efforts to cope with the consequences of war-induced flood and famine also had military strategic consequences, becoming a subject of contention and competition among various regimes that controlled parts of Henan at different times: the Chinese Nationalists, the Chinese Communist Party, the Japanese, and their Chinese collaborators. Spatially, my study focuses in on the counties in eastern Henan that from 1938 until the river's eventual rediversion in 1947 were at the heart of the province's Yellow River flooded area. The narrative also moves with displaced people from Henan to Shanxi province in the west, where hundreds of thousands of Henan refugees migrated during the war years. So how does one go about tying together war, flood, and famine? To do that, my analysis of Henan's travails and their aftermath focuses on energy flows through and between societies and their environments. By seeing human societies as embedded in larger organic systems, this approach renders legible connections between phenomena that conventionally get treated as discrete. Using this framework, my book analyzes the redirection of energy flows in Henan during World War II, as well as the massive ecological disturbances that it caused. Pivoting on the notion of energy and energy flows, I contend that the metabolism of militaries and societies shapes the choices of commanders, the fates of communities, and the course of environmental change. Like all sorts of socioeconomic systems, militaries have metabolisms that enable them to maintain their structures, grow, and reproduce. Nature's energy is ultimately what makes warfare possible. Militaries consist of vast agglomerations of humans, animals, machines, raw materials, logistical networks, engineering works, and all kinds of other components. They can therefore be seen as organic systems that continuously interact with their environment, engaging in transfers of energy and materials. Militaries must struggle for strategic advantage as well as for limited energy sources. The better they gather, store, and deploy that energy, the greater their potential for organized violence, coercion, and destruction. Now, in the English language, the words energy and power are virtually interchangeable. As the environmental historian Richard White has pointed out, both energy and power involve the ability to do work and to command labor. To be powerful is to be able to accomplish things, to be able to put the energy and work of nature to your own purposes. Now, more than anything, it was actually the language employed in the archival sources on wartime Henan that led me to devote my attention to energy. Participants in the Sino-Japanese War on all sides engaged in constant discussion of topics that approximate what we now think of as energy. But they did so utilizing their own conceptual and semantic categories. So what were those categories? Well, the documents don't ever, at least the ones that I've read, contain the word that contemporary dictionaries will gloss as the translation for energy, that is, nengyuan. They don't talk about nengyuan. But they make constant reference to another word, li, a character that connotes power and the capacity to do work. Wartime documents discuss li in all kinds of different forms, right? Some of them are listed up here. They talk about bing li, military power. They talk about ren li or min li, the human labor power. They talk about cai li, which is financial power, wu li, material power, draft animal power, chu li, all kinds of different sorts of li. They talk about sheng chan li, also all sorts of different types of li, right? So all of this is being discussed in the documents. Now, what is li? Well, li is an animating force that runs through humans and environment, constantly changing its character and manifestations with greater and lesser concentrations appearing in different places and at different times. One can translate li as power, understood as energy harnessed and exploited for certain human ends. The meanings attached to li in the archival documents from wartime China melded earlier ways of thinking about li as the capacity to do work with the modern scientific concept of force. All right, so you have a kind of accretion of meanings in the early 20th century with the earlier meanings of li being supplemented by new ideas that were introduced in the early years of the 20th century. So it's kind of a hybrid concept. During World War II, North China remained largely an advanced organic economy without a significant industrial sector powered by fossil fuels. No mechanisms existed to extract and transport hydrocarbon energy or process it into forms useful for modern militaries. Waging war thus required massive concentrations of people, animals, food, and fuel. Differential access to those energy sources corresponded to power differentials between people. The only way to achieve political dominance and military success was to command large amounts of human and animal muscle power, as well as food supplies. Framing war in terms of struggles over various incarnations of energy and power reveals how military forces in China tried to exploit ecological systems and the distortions caused by their interventions. By examining how civilian populations endeavored to obtain the energy that they needed to stay alive, this approach also provides insights into the social history of how residents of Henan's flooded area lived through war-related ecological disasters. So environmental history, military history, and social history illuminate one another while making us rethink the boundaries between them. Thinking in terms of energy flows also makes it possible for us to integrate the Yellow River as an actor into the environmental history of the Sino-Japanese War. The reason is that the same energy that drives all sorts of human activities, including the waging of wars, also propels the Yellow River, right? When speaking about the river's energies, our sources rarely use the word li. Sometimes they do, but usually they don't. Rather, they employ the related character shi, which Mark Elvin has in sort of characteristically brilliant and idiosyncratic fashion translated as position power, right? But if you look at the character, it's clear that Li is literally at the root of shi, right? Both in terms of the character's structure and in its definition. Best thought of as a kind of gradient or force field, shi moved matter or objects in a particular direction, flowing easily downhill, but moving uphill only at great cost. The river's position power was a manifestation of power, the generalized vital force that impelled all action. The river's energy, therefore, was but one of the many different forms that power could take. If we understand the environmental history of war in this particular way, we can map perpetual gains and losses of energy among various human and non-human entities. As energy and power flowed through society and environment, it formed stronger and weaker concentrations. Gaining power in one incarnation led to its loss in others. World War II witnessed competition for energy between Chinese and Japanese militaries, intensified struggles between the nationalist regime and its local subordinates, and contradictions between pursuit of military advantage via manipulation of the river's energies and the consequent loss of energy embodied in human and animal labor, agricultural output, fuel, and other resources. So if we sort of think about this conceptual framework, you can imagine far-reaching webs woven together by transfers of energy. Various actors struggling for power occupy and move from one node in these webs to another. Energy transfers occur across vast spaces as militaries and civilians renegotiate their roles and possessions. By straining one thread in these webs of energy transfer, actors may break another. So if we depart from this conceptual discussion and move into the nitty-gritty of the history itself, we can see how these energy transfers played out and what their consequences were. In the strategic flood of 1938, the Chinese nationalists unleashed the Yellow River's destructive energy to counter Japanese military forces. Breaching the dikes greatly increased the energy required for the Japanese army to carry out its military advance, as well as all of its other logistical requirements, which of course were energy requirements as well. After the river's strategic diversion, Chinese and Japanese armies confronted one another across its new course, making Henan a vital frontline region. To consolidate their power and political authority, militaries tried to divert and manipulate the river's flow. Chinese and Japanese forces engaged in what can be called hydraulic warfare, vying to harness the river's power and energy and deploy it against their adversaries. So what happens is opposing armies worked with, on, and against the river to obtain military objectives, undertaking projects to channel and direct its waters to fortify their position and threaten those of their enemies. All of those struggles were over power, contests over who could control the river, alter its course, and secure its benefits. The way that they did that was by building embankments like this one, another archival photo. To carry out those plans to manage the river, Chinese nationalist authorities, Japanese armies, as well as their Chinese collaborators had to mobilize huge amounts of labor and resources, right? To build these dikes, to maintain them, to do all of those things that are involved in water control. The river, therefore, demanded huge expenditures of human energy to match its own energy. Manipulating the river to gain strategic advantage required power, the ability to gain advantage from the labor of others. And here we have soldiers, nationalist soldiers, directing conscripted laborers to shore up dikes along the Yellow River during the war. The issue was that with the depopulation of this flooded area after 1938, right, 1.17 million displaced people, getting those energy sources, right, embodied in human labor became extremely difficult. So there's a lot of documentation about figuring out how to enlist these civilian laborers to work on water control. War and militarization exploited and disrupted Henan's human-constructed agrarian ecosystems, which demanded huge inputs of energy as well, right? So not only was this a military factor or a military issue, it also severely disrupted the human-centered environments that were agriculture in North China. All sorts of agricultural landscapes are human-made or anthropogenic. From late imperial times on, human labor sculpted China's agroecosystems to an unusually high degree. These hyper-anthropogenic landscapes required vigilant management as well as constant investments of labor and resources. Without those inputs, rapid and costly deterioration was what followed. Given the vulnerability of those human-constructed environments to neglect, wartime population loss brought about severe ecological decline. Creating and maintaining agroecological and hydraulic systems, in other words, consumed huge energy flows in the form of human labor and materials. In the 1930s and 1940s, diversion of energy to military conflict thus led to environmental degradation and disorder. In other words, energy that's needed to maintain agricultural production is being diverted to military conflict. By the early 20th century, the task of maintaining North China's environmental infrastructure could already come to entail mounting ecological costs. We need to stress the importance of baselines when we're looking at environmental histories of war, right? Environments are not pristine to begin with. It's not like they are in a perfect condition before war comes along and degrades them. Indeed, prior to the Japanese invasion of the late 1930s, North China's environment by no means existed in any kind of untarnished or natural condition. Centuries of intensive human exploitation and management had thoroughly altered the landscape, removing forests and other vegetation to make way for farms. Ecological diversity, and hence resilience, declined. Population growth pressed resources to the limit, and ecological buffers were lost. Indeed, by the 19th century, North China confronted what several historians have labeled an environmental crisis. Deforestation intensified erosion and caused sediments to accumulate in the Yellow River and other river systems, necessitating higher dikes and resulting in more frequent and costly floods. Loss of vegetation cover led to critical shortages of fuel as well as building materials. By the early 20th century, environmental decline, especially the siltation of rivers, was unprecedented. The frequency and scale of flooding, as well as famine, during the Republican period of 1911 to 1949 far exceeded anything that had occurred previously. China's war against Japan caused dislocations that destabilized these fragile landscapes and upset precarious ecological balances, triggering acute cataclysmic shocks. The disruptions created by Japanese invasion, as well as the Yellow River strategic diversion, led to large-scale displacement that dispersed energy embodied in human labor power and made intensive management of environmental infrastructure all but impossible. Ecological degradation was the result. Attaining and maintaining order in anthropogenic agroecological and hydraulic systems, as with militaries and other complex structures, takes energy. But energy used to maintain armies and fight wars, or energy dispersed due to military dislocations, can't be used for other purposes. Without adequate inputs of labor and resources, agricultural and hydraulic systems quickly spiraled into disarray, and recovery was rendered impossible. All of this ecological damage dealt a severe blow to the production of energy surpluses through agriculture in Henan. Short-term climatic change added another shock because in 1941 and 1942, North China experienced unpredictable weather and low precipitation levels that were connected to a strong El Nino event that happened during that period. As a result, Henan's agricultural output in 1942 fell to below 30% of normal. But the difficulty was that war still demanded huge concentrations of energy. And here we have people hauling grain to supply the military in rural Henan during the early 1940s. As a frontline region, Henan's devastated agroecological system had to provide labor and materials to satisfy the army's insatiable appetite. Richard, that's one's for you. To secure food energy for the army, the nationalist regime extracted grain taxes, compulsory purchases, and other levies. The Japanese army also launched grain raids for the same purpose. The rural populace ended up providing additional energy as soldiers and laborers. Conscription of able-bodied males, like this one, kept their labor out of agriculture, reducing crop yields even further. All of these factors combined to create what could be called an energy crisis in which millions of people could not obtain the calories needed for their minimal subsistence. Other provinces had adequate grain supplies at this time, but wartime disruption of transport ruled out timely transfers of relief grain. And the outcome you can see here. The devastation of hydraulic infrastructure that I've already described intensified famine's effects. During the 1943 wheat harvest, the Yellow River's dikes broke in several places, and Nationalist General Tang Enbo mobilized 500,000 laborers to make repairs. But the project ended up diverting labor power that was needed to bring in grain and relieve the hungry. War-induced flood and famine ended up displacing millions of people in Henan, forcing them to adapt to unfamiliar environments and find ways to secure the energy that they needed to survive. These ecological adaptations also had an impact. Many flood victims earned money by gathering and selling energy that was stored in organic biomass as fuel for heating and cooking and all the other things that people need that kind of energy for. But at this time, few refugees could actually go and cut down trees. In a part of China that had already been deforested for centuries, and where fuel shortages existed since the 19th century, refugees basically took whatever they could find. They gathered brush, grass, chaff, roots, basically anything that could serve as fuel. These refugee survival strategies, as a result, made fuel shortages even more severe than they were before. Extraction of biomass deprived soils of organic nutrients and subjected land that was already jeopardized by erosion to even greater damage. Displaced people placed additional pressure on scarce resources in the areas of in-migration, where they moved during the war, and dramatically altered the environments of those places, especially at the sites where China's wartime state resettled refugees to reclaim land for agricultural production, right? So land reclamation during the wartime period was a key way in which the nationalists, as well as the communists, were trying to generate more food to fuel the war effort. And it's interesting, while I was at the Hoover Institute, I was looking through Chiang Kai-shek's diary, and in one of the periods when there was the most intense bombing of Chongqing, he actually didn't mention the bombing. He basically wrote, we need to pay more attention to Yellow River water control and land reclamation. And when I saw that, it was sort of like, oh, this is actually an important topic after all. I'm not completely wasting my time. If Chiang Kai-shek thought it was important, then I must have been onto something. So anyway, much of this wasteland that was reclaimed during the war years consisted of upland areas covered with trees and other vegetation. Unlike Henan, Shanxi provinces, Huanglongshan region, which was the site of the largest wartime resettlement project, actually had some forests because it had been depopulated due to the Muslim rebellions that took place in the late 19th century. Land reclamation during the late 30s and early 1940s converted these wooded landscapes to agricultural production, simplifying ecosystems, jeopardizing wildlife habitats, and accelerating soil erosion. All of those ecological changes carried deleterious consequences for the health and well-being of the most vulnerable refugee populations. So this place, Huanglongshan, is an example of a part of China that is susceptible to a very weird kind of disease that's connected with selenium deficiency called Kushan disease. And when all of these people moved into this area and started farming marginal land, very quickly, a lot of them got very sick and started, so one of the colloquial terms for Kushan disease is vomiting yellow water disease, because that's what happens when you are affected by that particular ailment. So this place didn't last very long, because by 1946, there were already these big disease outbreaks and people left. So again, this is a way in which the environmental consequences of war, in terms of its second order effects, actually have a real direct impact on human health and well-being. So World War II clearly did tremendous damage to North China's natural landscape. But the other thing that I want to stress is that war-induced environmental decline is really only one part of the story. After World War II's end, and even as China was embroiled in civil war between the nationalist and communist parties, Henan's most badly damaged areas quickly experienced resettlement, socio-environmental reconstruction, and the recreation of productive agroecosystems. This is basically what the recovery efforts were faced with at the end of the war. You can see it really was a flooded area. Here's another image of the post-war landscape. These were taken in 1946. So in a surprisingly short amount of time, this kind of landscape was restored to the kind of agricultural environment that had existed prior to 1937. That recovery did not result from nature's powers of regeneration alone. Repairing ecological degradation caused by war-induced neglect came about through active human management. Recovering from damage caused by war-induced neglect of agroecosystems demanded huge flows of energy embodied in labor and resources, as well as agencies capable of channeling and coordinating them. After 1945, large-scale external assistance came from the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, or UNRWA, which launched redevelopment programs in war-torn areas of China in conjunction with the nationalist regime's Chinese National Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, or CNRRA. In 1946 and 1947, tens of thousands of laborers supervised by UNRRA and CNRRA exerted their energies to return the Yellow River to its pre-1938 course. UNRRA, CNRRA offered considerable material support to refugees as well, as they were returning to their homes in Henan, and assisted them in bringing land back under cultivation. In conjunction with the labor of the rural populace, processes of post-conflict ecological reconstruction garnered huge energy subsidies from these transnational relief agencies. Without those external inputs, human communities could not have remade warscapes into productive agroecosystems so quickly, and the environmental scars of war would have persisted much longer. So with that external assistance, farmers reclaimed nearly all of the previously flooded area by 1949, and by 1951 and 1952, the landscape gave little indication of the disasters that had occurred a few years earlier. So here we have one of the tractors that was brought in by UNRRA to help reclaim lands. And this last image is basically a wheat field growing in land that had previously been abandoned and depopulated. So the last thing that I want to emphasize is that all of these rapidly changing ecological conditions in Henan's flooded area shaped the geostrategic terrain on which the final stage of the Chinese Civil War between the Nationalists and the Chinese Communist Party was fought. The Yellow River took on renewed strategic importance in the late 1940s as nationalist leaders sought to isolate communist forces in eastern Henan by returning the river to its pre-1938 course. And that's what they did in 1947. But contrary to nationalist intentions, the rediversion decreased the water barrier between nationalist and communist armies, affording the CCP greater mobility. The Civil War of 1946 to 1949 proved much less devastating than World War II, enabling recovery to proceed without serious impediments. Population return and agricultural recovery gave the communists and the nationalists more reason to control the flooded area, making it a point of military contestation. The direction of the Chinese Civil War in Henan depended largely on which side could better secure energy and resources for its military. Struggles over energy intersected with China's most significant political transformation in the 20th century. At the height of World War II and the Civil War, nationalist military macroparasitism, that is, the extraction of energy for the military, damaged its host society, seizing food supplies for the army and drafting men as soldiers and laborers. Unable to effectively channel and coordinate large energy flows, the nationalist military position crumbled. A more symbiotic balance, by contrast, undergirded the expansion of communist influence in North China. In the wake of the 1942 and 1943 famine, CCP forces in Henan had improvised relatively stable and effective methods of exploitation that benefited armies and civilian populations alike. After 1945, the CCP also proved adept at attracting returning refugees and their labor powers to its base areas in Henan's flooded area, enacting land reform in conjunction with land reclamation. This capacity to innovate more stable ways of extracting energy from ecological systems explains the consolidation of CCP power in local society, at least in this particular region. For the nationalists, a desperate need to extract energy and remold the hydraulic environment to meet its strategic priorities gave rise to socio-ecological disruptions that paved the way for military collapse. The Communist Party's forces in Henan during the 1940s at least proved more capable of adapting to changed environmental conditions and improvising ways of capturing energy they needed to survive. To an extent, the contrast between the ecological impact of the nationalist and communist militaries derived from their tactics. The nationalists engaged in positional warfare, while the communists relied on guerrilla tactics, which gave them more mobility and flexibility. Differing military strategic choices, necessitated by the war against the Japanese, resulted in different ecological outcomes, which also had military and political implications during the Civil War. So I've already gone on for quite a while, and I'll wrap up there and look forward to your questions. Thank you.